Thank you now. After the loss of the Batavian administration in 1806, the Brits repossessed administration, marking the second British admin, and this administration came with a lot of changes, which we are calling reforms. And these reforms were in the economy, reforms in the church, language and education, the judiciary, and administration. That's where the reforms were effected. And by reforms we mean changes. So changes were done in all those areas. The economic reforms were basically on the use of currency. The currency reform, where paper money, and that was the British pound, they replaced the the Dutch dollar, which was known as the Rijks. Originally it was the Dutch dollar or Rijks which was in operation, but now it was being replaced by the British pound sterling, and which came to be used as a new form of currency. The salaries of government officials were reduced. Why was this one done? It was intended to ensure that the expenditure, government manages the debts, to avoid debts, and paying these officials a lot of money, when actually the government treasuries were put at risk. So they had to pay less so that they can manage their budgets, to avoid having deficit budgets. So government had to pay government officials a wage which was not so much inflated, to avoid having those economic problems, which we would see them being thrown into what? Into bankruptcy. So they paid a wage that was sufficient enough to the government officials. The giving of help to immigrants was put off. Originally, the Dutch used to give those immigrants into the Cape some financial assistance. That was abolished by the new admin of the British. Why? Because a lot of money had been spent on the immigrants, which in one way or another can explain on the heavy debt burden and finally being declared bankrupt. Trade restrictions were removed. In other words, all could trade freely and enjoy the profits which we are accruing from this from this trade. So the removal of trade barriers was very, very, very good as far as trade was concerned. So those were the reforms that were effected from this economic aspect. The British reforms in the economy finished. We look at reforms in the church. How did the changes affect the church? The church, one, freedom of worship. Pray the way you want. That's how the British gave the orders. Freedom of worship. Everybody is supposed to pray in a church of his choice, which was not the case with the other admin before, where it was a monopoly of one church, and which was the Dutch Reformed Church, or DRC. The government was responsible for paying the priests. The government was now taking over the role or the duty of paying these priests who had served in the respective churches. So because of this, we realized that the performance of the priests now started improving. Why? Because they were now sure of salary, which was not the case before. The churches were allowed everywhere. Churches allowed everywhere. Yes, because of this, very many churches sprang all over they came. And when we compare with the past, that is the Batavian or the Dutch administration, churches were a handful, they were countable. They were countable, and which of course was giving less freedom to worship. So because of the churches being able to mushroom everywhere, people were able to praise and worship. Language and education reforms, they were also effected, where English replaced the Dutch language. It was only one language during the Batavian administration that was allowed, and that was the Dutch. But with the coming of the British, they now replaced the Dutch language with the English. Dutch language abolished completely. Not anywhere did we see the Dutch language being used. It was completely abolished and given a final blow. And of course, the English language now also became very important in the educational system. Yes, in the class. In class, instruction was in English, replacing the teaching in Dutch. So the children who had been taught in Dutch language now came to adopt a new system of being taught in the English language. And the continuous teaching in these languages brought a new era where the Dutch English, the Dutch language, slowly by slowly died out. And the instruction in English meant that even the products of education, those are the people who finished school, went out and even spread the English everywhere. So schools were areas of indoctrination. So the indoctrination of the English language became the order of the day. But originally it was the Dutch language being used. So English language replaced Dutch. Another reform was reforms in the press. The press reforms. Freedom of press was emphasized, where the press, the newspapers would write anything, could be even critical of the government. But the Dutch could not allow this, so freedom of the press and very many papers were printed. In fact, this one came hand in hand with the liberal laws of printing. Printing presses were given liberal laws to print, and but before printing, to ensure that the printer or these news were edited, we were allowed to deposit a minimum of $300, £300 before printing of your article. So articles that were deemed right to print were printed basing on the initial down payment of 300 pounds. What was the intention of this? It was intended to get the best news or the best printer, and this one came to be called censoring of the press. The press had to be censored to ensure that people read what is desirable and not anything to be put on market for reading. Judicial reforms in the judiciary. This came with the introduction of a new charter of justice. A new charter of justice was introduced, and what does that mean? That for everybody working in the judiciary, you had to follow this. It was like a new constitution set for the judicial officials to follow. And this charter of justice, which had been introduced, ensured that justice was given irrespective of color, irrespective of economic status, and it was for all. Otherwise, during the time of the Dutch, it was justice given in accordance to color. So at times it would be justice denied. So this charter allowed everybody to access justice without any consideration given. That was very good. So this charter of justice was very good to all. Judges appointed by the British. It was the British to appoint the judges. Whoever worked in the judiciary or any other, whoever worked in the judiciary was to be appointed by the British themselves. Why? Because they were trying to look at the production of the best judges that would administer justice without inclining on any of those other consideration of race, status, and so on. Judges independent. They did not work under the pressure of the executive. That was very good. That one is called independence of the judiciary, where the judiciary performs its duty without due interference from those above. This was a blessing. The British laws replaced the Dutch laws. Yes, and this was a welcome idea, especially for the blacks, like the Khoikhoi, who were being given injustice by the Dutch courts. Dutch laws now were no more. Those which were so segregative were being replaced by the new law of the English. Court sessions in public. Court sessions were in public. Court sessions in public, and everybody was supposed to be produced in courts of laws, where a hearing was read. Reading was public. It was not hidden. So it was very good, so that people knew it is justice that had been well administered, because everything was done in public, and the people were given interpreters to know how the court sessions were moving, which was not the case in the Batavian. By 1836, professional judges had been appointed. Professional judges. That word professional is very important, because these people worked in the Batavian or the Dutch administration. Most of them didn't have the knowledge of the law. They didn't have the knowledge of the law, but just worked on other consideration, experience. For example, the matrimonial laws, the matrimonial court did not even consider anything, but they just passed those laws without considering that the professionalism was very important. So professional judges appointed by the British, which came to save very many discrepancies in the law. Lastly, we have administration reforms. Reforms in the administration. Advisory council was one of them. The council to advise administrators to make laws or to make policies that are against the people. Legislative council, that the legislature should be put in place for people to be represented. Yes, the views of the people be represented where? In the legislative council. Slave trade abolished, no more. The Dutch had brought slave trade, it was no more. Working hours reduced, so that people get time to rest. Slaves to marry. Slaves had been told to marry, which was not the case in the past. Slaves allowed to marry. Africans to be paid for work. It was not work without what? Payment. All land to be mapped and surveyed, so that people now are given enough security over their land, because they had been grabbed, the land had been grabbed, so it was given mapping and survey. The Khoikhoi to get their land back. This had been grabbed from them, but they were to be given the land back. use of passes to all migrants. Yes. Why did they provide this? This one reminds me of the Kipande in Kenya. Because the immigration policy had seen very many people come without even permission. So these illegal immigrants were checked by being given what? A pass card. So that they move with permission, with the documentation. And lastly, civil rights were introduced. What did this one mean? Civil rights, that people had the right to live in their areas without interference from anybody. The civilians, as it portrays, had the right over property ownership, over everything, and to be considered human. So those are the civil rights that were introduced by the administration of the British. So from there, we realized that it had brought the golden era. The Brits had brought the golden era for the people. Not only the whites themselves, but also the other settlers at the Cape. Next time, we'll look at the reforms introduced by Lord Somerset in line with the British reforms at the Cape.